Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Cook, and today we have an awesome guest, Lee Ragsdale, who's the Senior VP of Energy Delivery at North Carolina Electric Co-ops. Thank you, Lee, for joining us today. I'm excited to jump into this conversation, but I just want to throw it over to you real quick to give yourself an introduction of, what are you doing in your role, and then we'll start talking all things Grid Mod.
Great, thanks. Excited to be here. My name is Lee Ragsdale. I'm Senior Vice President of Energy Delivery for the North Carolina Electric Co-ops. I still stumble through this too as well sometimes. It's a mouthful, but at NCEMC, at the North Carolina Electric Co-ops, we are doing a lot of interesting things with DER, and I look forward to sharing that with you. Energy Delivery, the team that I lead, is responsible for DER development, so the solar and storage and solar plus storage that we've built, as well as DER integration, our DERMS tool, our energy operations. And then we also have grid infrastructure, which is transmission planning and delivery point planning and transmission policy, along with our regulatory compliance. So we've got a lot of different pieces within energy delivery, but a lot of them point back to that new energy future where we're focusing on DER and integration and working together. I'm an engineer by trade, went to Georgia Tech, and have been with the co-ops now for almost 17 years.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
So you kind of encompass all of the things that we could talk about today.
Sure.
And, one thing that's, I'm noticing is, there's buzzwords in every industry, and the term grid modernization is becoming more and more, talked about, and it's kind of the essence. It's an essence in my mind. Like, it's a vision that all of the electric utility space really are having a point of reflection as they come upon this tipping point of embracing distributed energy resources. However, I would like to, always ground any conversation that anything that we're going to talk about or what's happening in the industry allows us to be better at serving the existing customers in how they use energy. And we're only in the beginnings of no regrets technology to enable this new energy economy that you spoke of. So from grid modernization, we can talk about all things DER, but also really the relative aspects of what are these fundamental building blocks that we're kind of all working on. So the first question I'd ask you is really, with everything happening, what do you foresee as the opportunity, some may say challenge, to this transition to clean and specifically, how's it changing this distribution system that you ultimately you're not owners of, you're a unique perspective, but you serve those that operate the distribution grid. So what do you think?
Yeah, and there's a lot to that question. As you've talked about on this podcast before, it is a challenge and an opportunity as well that we have more and more resources at the edge of the grid that are contributing. And so if you look back through our history, right, centralized generation transmitted out to the load pockets, and everything was a one-way flow from generation to load. And now we're seeing more and more distributed energy resources, inverter-based resources on the grid that are injecting, and that's changing flows. And it's changing how we think about resource adequacy. It's changing how we think about managing power supply. And it's changing how we think about operating the grid. From the simplest aspects of how protection and control works to the longer-term forecasting of how is it that we're going to provide affordable, reliable power to the members at the end of the line each and every day. And so the challenge is there's so many opportunities. The technology in that DER has a lot going for it, but we have to find the balance of how do we maintain system reliability? How does the physics of the system continue to operate with this changing resource mix?
Right. So coming from, your organization's perspective, what was more or less a tipping point that really, because I'll just say, ever since I've introduced to your company and what you guys have been able to stand up and really drive, from an innovative, like let's do this perspective. What was the tipping point or something that you saw happening that really triggered this aha moment that you must embrace this full situational awareness at the edge? Like you are, as we said, you don't actually own the physical assets that connect to the customer, but you do own or have the capability to visually help support the distribution of those electrons. So like what was like a moment or what technology or kind of an event that really let you guys lean in?
Yeah. So maybe before I get to that, North Carolina Electric Co-ops, we're a G&T co-op, generation and transmission
Explain
co-op.
that.
And we say big G, little t. We're actually a transmission dependent utility. We own about 3,000 feet of transmission line that connects one of our generating plants to the transmission grid, but we are dependent upon Duke Energy and Dominion for the transmission system in North Carolina. But we own generation and own generation power contracts to serve 26 distribution co-ops throughout the state. So the distribution co-ops actually own the distribution lines, sub-transmission lines, and they deliver power to the end users, the ultimate consumers, their members, their member owners. So NCEMC works with our distribution co-ops to provide beneficial power supply. The first real, and I don't know if I would call it a tipping point, but the first real movement that we had was back in 2014, we started building community solar for our members. And so now we have 20 community solar sites distributed across the state, about 2 megawatts. So they're small, they're 50, 100, 200 kW community solar sites, but they're sited throughout the system. That was a starting point of this crawl, walk, run type sort of mentality. We started with community solar. Now we've branched out and we have solar that we own. We have solar plus storage that we own. We have standalone storage that we own. We've built and have 5 microgrids online now. And so that community solar started it. And then it was, how do we take that and move it to the next level? How do we continue to advance it? How do we continue to see where there are opportunities to utilize that resource and to benefit from that resource? And so we've leveraged that. We've seen the technology of DR advance as well. We have a pretty robust thermostat and water heater program that we benefit from. That started right around the same time as that community solar program. And so we went 2 different ways, on the generation side as well as on the demand response side. And so how do we bring those together? And that really started us down this road, and we've just continued to build upon it. Once we got enough resources, we had to update our DRMS, and we created a DERMS platform so that we have both the solar, the storage, the microgrids paired in along with those DR devices. And so it's having a single spot of control allows us to build our capabilities. We took that and then built into what we call the distribution operator. So now we have visibility and coordination of all of these DER, not only downstream to the distribution co-ops and helping them coordinate, but also upstream. We're providing visibility to Duke and to Dominion about what's going on behind our delivery points from a DER perspective, so that we can collectively operate the system better. I think we're unique in that, and that ability to provide that visibility and coordination upstream. And we've seen some benefits from that as well.
I couldn't agree more. And I think a few tidbits, just for our listeners, one thing about the electric utility industry, the grid in itself is talked about holistically a lot, but I think a lot of people don't understand the fundamental differences of what's required and needed from a generation, bulk generation. So then the transmission, the distribution, and the customer edge. And so everything that you just spoke of kind of touches upon, an aspect in one shape or form that could impact it. And so I think it's fascinating, for North Carolina, you had emerging solar, but it wasn't a large proliferation or, thereof. You said small projects, and then you ultimately rolled into all of these other technologies as you needed them. So like, from a perspective of like, what kind of onboarding or like technical acumen that would need to be built up within your walls to really embrace commissioning like a microgrid, right, for your end users? Like, what kind of level of effort would be required from your perspective, just to go from 0 to like, let's have a microgrid?
It's a lot of effort, and there's a lot of different expertise that's brought to bear. And we've done a really good job of leveraging our relationships outside of our walls, because there's no one expert that can bring it together. One of those things you learn about a microgrid, you've learned about a microgrid, because every microgrid is unique. But we've partnered with EPRI and have talked to them about microgrid controllers and microgrid design. We have several engineering firms in the North Carolina area that are really informed about microgrids and have helped us work through those aspects, whether it's transformer grounding and control systems and operations and how they all work together. There are plenty of opportunities in that space to try to figure out how do we continue to integrate. But we've done it steps at a time. Our first microgrid in 2017 on Ocracoke Island was a test lab. We added in a Tesla battery, we had a 3 megawatt generator, we added in some solar and some DR devices, and experimented with how that control system works and how we can integrate those resources. We then leveraged that with Butler Farms, which is a hog farm where they take the hog waste and produce methane, and that methane generation is there. We added a battery, and now we can actually serve the community with resources on the farm, which is a great story. That one was made possible by having a wonderful partner in Mr. Tom Butler. He embraced the idea, and we were aligned in our goals. And I think every microgrid we've done since then has had partners both in the community as well as in the engineering space to help us make it work better. And that's culminated now with our fifth microgrid, Roseacre Farms, which is a 3.5 megawatt load. We added a 2 megawatt solar and 2.5 megawatts of energy storage. And just a week ago, we successfully islanded for 38 minutes, and it was a seamless island. We had the operators on the phone, and they said, "When are we going to go to island mode?" And we're like, "We're already in island mode. You didn't even notice the transition." So it's a great approach that we can see, the success of bringing these resources with partners to bear, and see how we can continue to utilize those resources.
And I'll just share for the listeners, Lee and I and myself probably just smiled because that smooth transition is a huge success that, probably took a lot of forethought and a lot of questioning from the very beginning. And then to have it happen, you're just you don't have a whole lot of people to celebrate with, but that's exciting.
Right. Well, and you've heard of how we've been doing testing. We've been working on this for 6 months, and we had load banks out there to test it separately and not impact the consumer. And now we finally got to the point where it's live and it's commissioned, and it seamlessly did it, and they didn't even notice. And that is the key, right? Because they have some sensitive equipment, and so if they had noticed it, that would have been we have to step back. But to have it happen like that, it was really, really exciting.
Kudos. And I guess I'm kind of coming from a place where I'm actively working on, deploying and really trying to drive the conversation and the storytelling around the needs of a microgrid. So, and for the customers and the customer benefit, right? Just to drive the understanding that for any new technology to be adopted into a grid, as you said, everyone's unique. So even though the industry has been doing it, since 2012 in California and right, and you guys have started in 2017, there's still this uptick in building the technical acumen and really engaging all of the stakeholders to really make these projects happen. So it's not just something that can be done. Everything's its own little fingerprint. So it's awesome to hear.
Yeah, we're finding that the vendors, even the battery manufacturers, the solar manufacturers, the control systems, everyone is learning together because this is so new, right? Having these resources and having everything balanced, it's getting better, it's iterating, but everyone is learning together. And the challenge is, the larger grid has so much inertia. There's so much, there's so many resources, so much load. One little, change doesn't really impact things. But when you go to a microgrid and you have 25 meter points and two sources of power between a generator and a battery, there's a lot of system dynamics, a lot of physics that play differently than you have in the larger grid.
So thinking about, how we show up the electric industry and the uniqueness between state, between grid, between ownership, every, I think, innovative project is helpful in its own right. So like from
Mhm.
your perspective, you already shared a few exciting efforts. Like what are some other initiatives or some perspective of how you can share lessons learned to drive innovation towards a unique project? You guys talked about the microgrids, but how about the germs application you stood up?
Yeah, so the DERMS application has been an interesting process as well, in that we have a single application that manages both our generation resources, our solar and solar plus storage, as well as our demand response, our thermostats and water heaters. It's multiple technologies, integration with multiple different vendors and OEMs, and so bringing all of that together into one pane of glass so that your operators can see what's going on. There are so many capabilities with these resources, and we're just starting to tap into those capabilities. And the DERMS is the method, the vehicle for getting there. And so having the ability to schedule through one set helps to make life easier so that you can focus on the more complicated aspects of it. That being, the decision making on, let's say you have thermostats and you only have 5 calls that you can make per month on those thermostats because you want to manage customer fatigue with the demand response device. How do you make the decision on those 5 calls? And so we're working on some AI solutions to find better ways to anticipate what's the best time to call on those resources that we have to maximize value, but also to minimize disruption and minimize impact on the consumers, because there's definitely a balance there that you have to maintain. The DERMS is enabling that, but we're bringing those other decision tools in and integrating them into the DERMS as well.
See, there's so many little things that you're saying that like I just like I want to grab a hold of and like expand upon. But like, so when you think about what is grid modernization, is like, so we're preparing for a future that is a dynamic customer. So
Yep.
the I think one of my missions in life is to merge that conversation, that everything that's happening in the realm of how to operate the grid and ensure that the assets are being utilized to, to their capacity, as well as, they're there for tomorrow, is for the customer. And so now with everything happening where the customer is now suddenly becoming no longer a static representation in a mathematical equation, it's a dynamic variable. And so when we develop the technologies or the systems, it is specifically, like you just said, how do you create decision-making trees that doesn't fatigue the customer, right? So it's like at the core of it. And I think it gets lost in translation, especially when trying to get regulators or ownership or, where the dollars are being spent, is like, well, how's this benefit the customer? And so it's like kind of something that's hits my heart, because that's a question that's continuously asked. And to us, who's like at the forefront of it, well, it is for the customer. So I just love that it's like one of the uses of AI, which is another buzzword that we have to be careful of in grid modernization. But it's really to teach, right? Like you're literally running algorithms so that you understand, the feedback loop.
Right. And, I think there's a lot of little nuggets in that as well that I want to grab onto. Technology has really changed how we interact, right? And how we as consumers even interact. I think that, if you ask just an everyday person about their electric bill, they know that they pay it. And that's probably the extent of what they know. We're seeing more and more push for time of use rates to help drive customer behavior, because there are times of the day and times of the month when costs are higher. And so if we can impact customer behavior in those times, that's great. Well, again, if you're not thinking about your electric bill, if you're not thinking about your electric rates, you don't want to take those efforts. But technology allows you to. You can program in a time of use rate into your EV so that when you only charge during the off-peak times. You can program, Ecobee has the capability with their Eco Plus tool to program in a time of use rate so it adjusts your thermostat settings to balance your comfort in the home with minimizing your costs. So the technology now is allowing you not to have to worry about behavior, but it's getting your devices to behave appropriately. And we'll continue to extend that. Electric water heating. When we get into, I think we in North Carolina have a lot of electric heat pumps and electric resistance heating as well. But I think as that technology, as electrification has greater penetration, we're going to need more of these decision points to be automated so that consumers can make good decisions on money. And also those decisions happen to align with good decisions for the grid. And if we can take full advantage of the smart inverter capabilities that are now getting out there, and how we can communicate with solar and storage and build that as well, again, with a technology-centric approach, we can have the resources behaving on the grid so that we're not just having visibility and coordination, but we're actually having a grid that's dependent upon resources at the edge. And those resources are providing value to not only the site where they're on, the home that they're connected to, but also to their neighbors, to the greater grid. And I think that's where grid mod needs to get to, is to how do we utilize those resources from a technology perspective so that they can benefit everybody.
Right. And it's also that concept of we are the facilitators of electrons that serve all. So there are always going to be the early adopters and then the late adopters. And how do we transition that whole different phenomena, for all customers, while one is doing the smart thermostat and the EVs and the solar and the charging, while the others, have their very static load. And I think, how do we, represent or show that as we become more electric energy use centric, there's actually what we want to create is ways to make it easier to use less to benefit like the bill.
Right.
And so it's kind of counterintuitive, but getting enough time to really show that message and then have the data to say, look,
that's right.
If we drive the time of use, you actually will pay less, even though you're using more. And so just that conversation, I think is just going to be more apparent as we, deploy some of these technologies like you guys have done. So,
and it's easy to think about the money aspect and the cost and making things affordable. But we also have to remember that we have an obligation to serve, and we manage reliability. We need to be there for them. And so how we effectively use those resources locally to manage reliability and resilience is also really important. And that's something that the utilities, we bring a unique perspective in that we have an obligation to meet a reliability metric, and we are doing our best every day to try to continue to do that. And so I think grid mod needs to have that focus as well on reliability and affordability.
Yes, because everyone is very dependent on those lights staying on 24/7, 365.
Yeah, that's right.
So with kind of wrapping up, for some of these aspiring electric utility industry next generation, what's some advice that you've seen that would really, kind of grab at the strings and really promote, working for this industry and where we see it going?
Well, I think I tell interns and young professionals, it's a very exciting time to be in the industry because it is changing so much. There's so much attention on what we're doing, and that's a good positive stressor. It's an opportunity for us to continue to transform and to find new ways. But 10 years from now, the industry is going to look different than it does today, and we're in a great place to position ourselves to continue to move in that direction. How do we get there? I'm not quite sure what technological breakthroughs are going to happen that are going to move us forward. I don't know, but I do know that it's an exciting time to watch it and to contribute. We are doing some really cool things in North Carolina and thinking through how these resources can work on our distribution grids. Our distribution co-ops are doing phenomenal work on managing the resources that they have. And so working together, we're pushing this forward. And so that's what's exciting to me, is that it's such a transition, and it's an opportunity to continue to do what we have been doing, but to make things even better.
So there's definitely the changing of the tides of that's how we used to do it to how can we do it differently, which is just provides this creative, innovative perspective that I think really drives the young minds to change. So that's a great advice.
Yeah.
So with that, I just want to say thank you for the conversation and for showing up for all of your customers in North Carolina as
Absolutely.
We all voyage ahead in this new world to come. So thanks, Lee.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I had a good time.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.